to talk about Sandra for a minute. Sandra is amazing. She's a PhD student at Vienna, and she will soon be starting as a postdoc at Princeton in the environmental school. She and I designed this work, but she is definitely the lead. She did the slides. Everything that's brilliant about this project is hers, and my primary contribution today is to gesticulate wildly. If I were to ask you what percentage of Americans, think about 10 average Americans, what percentage say that protecting nature is an important value to them? Not just like something good for the world, but something that's important to them, a core value of theirs. Think of a number in your head. Before I started this project, I would have told you 40%, but in fact, it is 80%. 80% of Americans, very little partisan disagreement here, as you'll see in a moment. Almost everybody agrees that protecting nature is a value to them. But there's this gap between my intuition, 40%, perhaps your intuition. I'm going to present data showing that when you ask people to guess other people's beliefs, it's actually 50. People are underestimating this by 80%. This is something you might have heard about before by some other speakers, a collective illusion, where everybody in a group, or almost everybody, believes something, but they systematically underestimate the extent to which other people believe that. We know that collective illusions in a lot of domains predict inaction, and so we're curious as to the extent to which that might contribute to inaction on biodiversity loss, particularly stopping it. 68% of Americans want the government to do more to stop biodiversity loss, and 96% of scientists who study biodiversity agree that it is harmful both to nature and to human society. Thankfully, there's a UN treaty on this called the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, signed by 192 UN member states. Those of you who passed social studies might know there's 193 UNU member states. Who wants to guess the country that has not signed on to this treaty? Yay. So that's the problem that we're inching toward solving. Getting the US public more knowledgeable about this, informing them on things they might be misperceiving, and hopefully pushing the United States towards signing the CBD. But of course, we have to ask ourselves, how many people in this country would support signing the CBD? And so we asked just that. We did a survey of 2,500 Americans, a representative sample, and asked them, how much would you support the US government joining the CBD? And critically, we did not tell them in this context that the US is such an outlier. We just wanted sort of their neutral reaction. And it turns out, almost all Democrats, the majority of Americans, and almost a majority of Republicans support joining the CBD. Obviously, there's some room for movement there, and so what we're interested in asking is how can we push the needle even higher up, particularly among Republicans. And as part of that survey, we also asked people to actually sign a petition, to exit the survey, go to another website, take the effort to sign a petition, and almost a quarter of the people did. So as a first pass, if we're going to design an informational intervention to tell people about the CBD, we have to ask a few questions. Where is there actual consensus? Where is there a collective illusion? So where is there consensus? Where is there an illusion about that consensus, a big misperception? And critically, does that collective illusion predict policy support? I've been talking all day about collective illusions, hoping to get you to assume that those collective illusions are actually predictive of attitudes and behaviors, but we're actually going to test some of those assumptions here. So first, we have to look at where there's agreement, where there's misperceptions, and then critically, that third step, does it actually predict policy support? And the referent for this collective illusion example that I've been giving has been the American public, the general population. But maybe that's not the right referent. Maybe that's not what people anchor on when they're trying to think about norms, change their behavior. Maybe it's their in-group. Maybe it's their out-group. Maybe it's none of those. Maybe it's scientists. Maybe they really care about what scientists think. Maybe it's not that. Is this a policy domain? Maybe what actually matters is beliefs about the number of countries that have signed on to this policy. You can imagine a collective illusion for each of these groups, perceptions of those groups as beliefs. But the question is, does it predict? A good intuition here is something like food. You can imagine Americans underestimating the amount of calories or fat or carbs in their food. That doesn't necessarily mean that that misperception predicts eating behaviors. And if you were to correct that misperception, you might be a little annoyed to find out it doesn't reduce eating habits or change eating habits. It's the same intuition here. Just because we can predict a collective illusion in each one of these domains doesn't mean it predicts behavior and attitudes. So first we have to understand where there is consensus. In that aforementioned survey of 2,500 Americans, so we find some interesting domains of consensus. Majority of Americans and all partisans believe that biodiversity loss is a problem, believe that addressing it is important, and it is a value. That's that same item I showed earlier. 80% of people believe that protecting nature is important to them personally. We also see, again, that support item, that 68% of Americans want the government to be doing more to protect biodiversity loss. So we do see evidence for consistent majority support, not only among the public, but among both parties. So then where might we find collective illusions? Where might we find the largest collective illusions? Let me show you 3 of the largest we found in our data. The first was on that values question. I remember I said I would guess 40%. So when you ask people to estimate how much other Americans think that protecting nature is a value, they underestimate it by 30% on average. Similar pattern for scientific consensus. People vastly underestimate the number of scientists, the percentage of scientists who think biodiversity loss is harmful. And then that country consensus, massive underestimation. Americans are not aware that the United States is an outlier, and in fact, not only do they guess below half, they get the number wrong by over 100 on average. So 3 huge collective illusions, but do these predict policy support? Or to put that concretely, do we think, is there evidence that the people who hold the biggest illusions, the most misperceptions, are the least supportive of joining the CBD, suggesting that if we correct that misperception, their support will go up? So what about that perceived values item? That 30% gap, is it predictive of support? Not really. That's a small trend line, not really suggestive that correcting that large collective illusion will actually change attitudes. All right, so what about the country consensus? Huge misperceptions, but it's not really predicting. All right, the people who are guessing 80, 90, getting the number wildly wrong, they're no more less likely to support the CBD. It's in fact the scientific consensus where we see a consistent and robust moderate relationship between people who underestimate the number of scientists who think biodiversity loss is harmful and people supporting the CBD, suggesting that this is a fruitful domain for an informational intervention. And that is the work that we're currently doing. We're currently designing an informational intervention that is, at this very moment, rolling out to 5,000 American participants to test whether informing them about the scientific consensus about biodiversity loss and its harms will increase their support, both attitudinal support, but also increase their behavior. For example, sending letters to their elected representatives, signing petitions, for joining the CBD. This is what that informational intervention looks like. As is always the case with informational interventions, we were worried that people wouldn't really understand it or wouldn't retain that information. So we ran a little pilot study. If you don't show people information, they don't update. But if you show people the information, they integrate. Something I said in my previous presentation, informational interventions work when people care. This suggests that people care. When you tell them the truth and then you ask them to repeat it back to you, they get it right. They don't reject the information that they might in other domains where they might be resistant to the truth. So to summarize, and these are some talking points that I mentioned in my other presentation, the US public agrees much more than they think. There's vast partisan agreement on many of these issues. The fact that that's not reflected in policy is the problem we're trying to solve. But as I also mentioned, and me talking about that guess of 40% wasn't chosen for random, experts do this too. In these surveys that we do on these misperceptions of social norms, things like expertise, things like education, almost never predict inaccuracy. And often they predict more inaccuracy. The more educated you are, the more politically knowledgeable you are, you actually show these misperceptions worse. So this is not just something that lay people have. We have it as experts, as researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. We hold these misperceptions that are overly pessimistic about what other partisans and lay people want to see on the policy level. And so being aware of that and communicating that consensus is key. I want to thank Sandra for making these slides, for doing this amazing work. I want to thank RARE for funding these surveys. And if you're interested in getting updates about that survey that's being actively rolled out, you can provide your email with that QR code, and Sandra will be in touch about the results of that informational intervention. Thank you very much.